Hey everyone, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. On this channel, I help you decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? You're being dramatic. And today we're diving into the 9th most banned book of 2023, Ellen Hopkins' Crank. According to Pin.org's list, which is where I curated most of my list of banned reads for this year, this book has been banned over 23 times throughout the US. According to the American Library Association, the book has frequently been banned and challenged in the United States because of its depiction of drugs, offensive language, and adultly explicit content. It was actually in the top 100 most challenged books throughout the decade of 2010 to 2019. Even making it into the top 10 list twice before last year, in 2010 and 2022, respectively. Ellen Hopkins herself was apparently even banned from speaking at a middle school in Oklahoma due to the appropriateness of her subject matter. In 2022, Crank was listed among the top 52 books banned by the Alpine School District in Utah, following the passing of the Utah Law HB 374, Sensitive Materials in Schools. Although, considering that 42% of the books banned by the Alpine School District has had LGBTQ plus representation within them, something tells me that there might be a little bit of an agenda for them there. But even with those cited reasons, I don't think I get it. Okay, so I can understand the first, because this story is ultimately about a girl's struggle with the monster that is the titular substance. For those of you, I'm pretty sure YouTube's gonna get mad at me if I say the actual name of the drug, but let's just say the drug is math, but with a bit of E on the side. But the other two feel like they're grasping at straws to find reasons to ban it. While there definitely is offensive language in it, it's not in large quantities and mostly relegated to scenes which use to show how far our character Christina is falling, and the damage she's doing to both herself and her family. As for the being explicit argument, that's, I guess, a little more debatable. There is a really rather tough to read scene in here about something in that regard, but for the most part, the book is a lot more chaste about its descriptions of these scenes than Identical was. Maybe the contrast is making me see less of it, but honestly, the cited reasons feel way overblown just from what I've seen, from what I've read. But I might be getting ahead of myself. You might be wondering why this book is considered number 9 of the most banned books of 2023, whereas last video was the number 11th. And that's because Ellen Hopkins' Identical tied with Sarah J. Maas's book, Empire of Storms, for 10th place. That's why I labeled Identical as the number 11th most banned book. Unfortunately, however, since Empire of Storms is book 5 in the Throne of Glass series, of which I've not read a single book, obviously that's going to be something I'm going to have to build up to over the course of time. It's not something I can just dive into. If I at least want to understand the book, that is to say. That being said, to discuss more about the book personally, Crank is Ellen Hopkins' debut novel, released on October 1st, 2001. The book itself is inspired by Hopkins' real-life daughter's struggle with Crystal, and the struggles that not only she went through, but also the family went through as well during this time. This book is a New York Times bestseller, though that means a little to me these days, and has been nominated and has won several awards. The cover of the book itself has a fair amount better than Identical, I would argue, the previous work I read of Hopkins, obviously. At first, the cover appears to be a white and black contrasting colors with bubbles, but when you get closer, you realize that while it's actually a depiction of the monster itself. Right off the bat, you know exactly what the story's going to be about without ever having to check the back. And it's an eye-catching cover to boot with the contrasting colors of black and white, along with the lettering helping with that. You even got this right here, which is actually fairly interesting to look at. You got the shadow or the shadow of white on black lettering against the black background. It's one of those things that will catch your attention when you walk by. I genuinely love it. But for the sake of context, here is the synopsis on the back. Life was good before I met the monster. After, life was great. At least for a little while. Christina is the perfect daughter. Gifted high school junior, quiet, never any trouble. Then she meets the monster, Crank. And what begins as a wild ride turns into a struggle for her mind, her soul, her life. And that's about all there is. That's literally it on the back. It's a relatively straightforward synopsis, but considering the subject matter within the book, that's perfectly understandable. Now, I already sort of gave away my first impression on this book when I talked about Identical. Though, admittedly, I will admit that I was a little less excited about the premise of this book before I read it. When I pulled it out of the shipping package from Amazon, don't hate me, I live in an area where the only bookstore is a guy who goes to Goodwill and thrift stores, buys all of his products, and then just resells them to people, slightly more expensive. I've caught him doing it. But anyways, when I pulled this book out, I was impressed by the length of the work, it being a rather denser project than I was expecting. And Hopkins' works were definitely the biggest of the banned books I've ordered this year. But when I opened the first page of Identical, I deflated and lost some interest, as I realized all of Ellen Hopkins' works was in free verse poetry. As you can tell here. Or here. Or here. That being said, I have nothing against poetry on principle. It's just not the biggest poetry buff, so it was inevitable that a bit of my excitement would wither away when I realized this. But that was merely my first impression of the book. What do I think about the book now that I finished reading it? I really enjoyed this work. Actually, I liked it a lot more than Identical, which says something because I did like Identical too. But before I start, let me go ahead and talk about some trigger warnings that are going to be applicable in this review, and the book overall. If any of the subjects that are mentioned below disturb you or risk bringing back very painful memories for you that you don't really want to subject yourself to, you may want to consider giving this video a skip. Crank is a work that I'm already very fond of, and it's for a variety of reasons. To start with the simplest, Ellen Hopkins' style of free verse poetry I feel works far better for this work than it did for Identical. In Identical, it felt like a purely aesthetic choice more than anything. And apart from the unique way she did the perspective switch between Kaylee and Rayanne, it didn't feel like the style contributed to the story itself, nor did she seem to do anything engaging with most of the poems. But with this book, the style feels more interweaved with the themes and the story. The free verse poetry lends a sense of the chaotic and disconnected thought process that fits Christina as she succumbs more and more to the monster that is consuming her life. It almost feels like at points you're actually in the mind of someone completely off their gourd on drugs with the way the page is structured. The way the sentences wrap around each other in a confused sense. The way things seem to be both abstract but overly described. It's sort of one of those things. There's also definitely a sense of raw emotion behind most of these scenes and stories. You can read the story and, without ever knowing the true story behind it, get the feeling that the author has personal experience with the things she's writing about. There are several points where I stopped and nodded, almost telling myself that the passage I just read had to be one that was directly translated from something that happened to Hopkins herself or her daughter, rather than something that was put through the artistic lens. And maybe that's why the story feels so much more interesting than Identical. It's a lot more personal for Hopkins, and for me. This is one of those times where I'd highly recommend reading one of the blurbs in the back where the author explains the true story behind what led her to write Crank. She is writing this from a place of personal experience, and though she's changed several things, it still is ultimately the story she lived. And for me as well. I've had my own experiences that I can realize here, not necessarily being a victim of the monster directly, but there are a couple of things I was able to connect with the more I read this book. One is just how easily Christina was sucked into the claws of the monster. She does it because she's infatuated with a hot guy, and from there it just gets worse and worse, even after this guy permanently leaves the picture. And this made me realize how close I may have come to something similar. See, back in the day, I had a good friend. Let's call him Jay for the sake of privacy. Now, I was generally a socially awkward kid who maybe had 2 or 3 real friends, and we were all the nerds of the school. We weren't the popular kids. My closest friend at the time was another discussion, but Jay was the first friend I made that seemed cool in that sense. He was the first friend I had that I made that brought out some of that energy people talk about when they refer to boys will be boys. We ran around outside a lot. We spent a lot of time at each other's house playing video games, talking about boy stuff like wrestling and, football and stuff like that. It was actually because of him that I got really into the Madden series for a while, and then I had to drop it again because Madden brought out the worst part of my competitive side for some reason, and I have absolutely no idea why. Like, I would almost pop blood vessels if I lost at that game, and I to this day, I don't know why. Maybe it's changed as I matured, but I'm getting off track. As I read this book, one of the things I remembered about my time with Jay was there was this one time, maybe a couple weeks or a month before he almost made me a convicted felon that forced us to stop hanging out, was that he was going to introduce me to a couple of friends of his. But he warned me that these guys were slightly picky about who they hung out with. And in order to fit in with them, I'd probably have to smoke a bit. I assumed at the time he meant the devil's lettuce, but honestly thinking back on it, I don't know for sure. He assured me that one puff would do it and I should be good. I could even just pretend to do it, only suck in a little bit and then hold it in as long as possible, saying I swallowed most of it or something. We were kids, we didn't exactly understand how that worked. And being the stupid kid I was, desperate to keep this close friend I made, I agreed to do it. And had I met those friends that he was talking about, I probably would have. Now, there's no guarantee that this meeting would have led down the path of worse things to come. But reading how easily Christina fell into the path she did caused me to sit back and wonder a bit maybe if I would be like Christina now if I had done that. What if it wasn't just some special oregano and I made the mistake of doing something much worse that I would never be able to pull myself out of? I haven't seen Jay for almost a decade now, so I have no idea what ever happened to him. But it's just one of those things you think about in the future and you think, could this have gone worse? The second and stronger reason for this book being far more personal for me is that I have been in Ellen Hopkins' shoes to a degree. I've watched more than one family member destroy their lives with an addiction, and a lot of the things Christina did are a lot of the stuff I've dealt with the after effects of. A quote from Hopkins sums it up pretty nice here in her the true story behind the Crank trilogy that she puts in the back of this edition. We witnessed her slide, tried to help her, tried to stop her. Finally, we had to push her away before she inflicted any more pain on those who loved her most. Her parents, her sibling, finally her children. We fought for her and with her, and because of her for 6 years, until the state of Nevada sent her to prison. The stress level was indescribable. We had legal bills, our house was broken into, checks, jewelry, and other valuables disappeared. Some of those checks were forged by a girl with a fake ID, a girl who looked a lot like me because she was my daughter. She'd call in desperate need of money. I'd buy her food, but that was all, because I didn't want to finance her addiction. I didn't see her often, but every time I did, she looked worse. Strung out, wrung out, skin and bones. She was killing herself and I couldn't stop her. I felt helpless, scared, angry, guilty. And when they finally locked her up, I was happy, because I knew she'd finally get the help she needed. It brings back the time where I had to deal with the same in my family. Hoping that they'd be picked up by cops so they'd finally get the help they needed, maybe shock them back into place. It reminded me of the time I stayed up for most of the night, watching over them as they almost OD'd on Xanax. It made me think about how some doors in my apartments have locks on them now because we couldn't trust them not to steal what they could find to fund the addiction. It's all a very personal thing. I'm not going to tell it here because it might also be a part of my story, but it's more their story to tell. And if any should tell it, it should be them. Just know that Hopkins is very much true when she says dealing with someone with addiction is something that affects everyone in the family, not merely the person with the addiction. The pain they cause isn't just pain they do to themselves, but pain they deal with everyone else. But they also weren't the only addict in my family. My father was an alcoholic, and while many may not see that along the same degrees as being addicted to crystal or E or any of those Peruvian marching powder, it is still an addiction. And unlike the former, there was no saving him because his addiction had already consumed him. My dad died on August 29th, 2020, which, for the record, was the worst year of my life, pretty much, beyond COVID merely being a thing. He was a severe alcoholic, and ultimately he drank himself to the point that his heart just gave up. I know it's not really a sordid tale of being seduced by an illicit substance and the downward spiral that it caused, but an addiction is addiction, regardless of what it is, too. He always kind of had a problem drinking, and it only got worse with time, as he was a cop, and he really didn't like trying to seek help for some of the shit he's seen. In my town where I grew up, it was a particularly nasty case he was called on, and I think that's ultimately what caused it to get so bad. He didn't ever want to admit that it got to him as much as it did, but it did. And you could see it, and despite trying to tell him, trying to get him to understand, he really didn't. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to accept he had a problem. Let's return to the book. But to return to the book, if I did have a couple complaints, one of them would be the ending. By the time you realize the book is on its final pages, you're probably going to be left with a, wait, what? Kind of feeling. It's just a sudden thing, like, out of nowhere, the book feels like it decided that, I've had enough, and ends. And of course, obviously, this is to mirror the real-life events, no doubt. But as a book, it's a disappointing way to end it all. I also feel like Chase was a strange character that I really am not sure what I was supposed to feel about him. The book almost seemed confused on him, as if it didn't quite want him to be seen as a bad guy. But he is also responsible for furthering Christina's addictions and supplying her, even if he himself has lines he won't cross. He reads a lot like Ian from Identical, meant to be a perfect boyfriend to Christina. But unlike Ian, who is meant to represent greener pastures and what true love looks like outside of the trauma, Chase just felt like another form of infatuation, like with Adam. Albeit with at least some genuine love for our protagonist, as opposed to Adam, who seems purely in lust with her. It's not to say that he isn't fleshed out or a complicated character. He is to an extent. I'm not sure in the end what the point of him being in the story was. He doesn't really contribute anything to the end. But since this is a tale based on a true story, it's a very minor nitpick, as Chase might very well just be a character that was in Ellen Hopkins' daughter's real life, who contributed, but again, it's kind of one of those weird things. In any case, I think this is a very good work. My personal rating for it is about a 9 out of 10, but I recognize that might be painted with my own biases due to personal experience. I do think, like Identical, it definitely is a book that should be read at least once. But unlike Identical, I can see myself potentially recommending this book more often, or maybe even one day returning to it and giving it another read-through. I'm curious about the sequels of this book, though I'm admittedly a little more hesitant to dive into them. As Hopkins herself says, this is the only book that's based on her personal experiences. I definitely have had a much harder time seeing where all the banning came from on this book, and I did dissect it a bit near the beginning. I want to thank a couple of commenters from my last banned book for helping me find better words to express what I wanted to say when I was doing my little rambling diatribe about, understanding why a book's been banned or something. I'm doing it again. I can't find the right words to express what I'm trying to say here. They're helping me find the words, the more appropriate words to express what I feel when it comes to how these books should be presented to a younger audience. There we go. I think I got it that time. And this probably isn't helped by the fact that I'm probably incredibly awkward. You can see it a lot more in my earlier videos. And with my ADHD, it's really easy to just go off on tangents when I'm trying to get to the point. Like I said in my video, I had to cut a whole section of me just rambling endlessly, trying to put my words together. And this is why I had to graduate from a script that's just a bunch of bullet points about what I'm talking about to jotting everything down like I'm writing an actual essay. But to quote Emily Reed's books from below, this is the best way I can describe it, and I'm really thankful that she helped give me the words to express this. Parents need to monitor the content their kids are reading and make sure that they are reading subjects and materials appropriate for them without censoring materials for others. what a kid is mentally prepared to handle and what they aren't is ultimately different per case basis. There are some kids I would trust with more mature material, and some kids I really wouldn't. And that all comes down to a case-by-case basis. You can't ban something on a generalization. And, as people pointed out in my last review, what is an uncomfortable read for someone like me and Identical is just true life for other people, as unfortunate as it is. And those kinds of books can help those people. They can start the conversations needed to be talked about. They can tell these people, they can show these people that what they're feeling is not something they alone are suffering, and they can find strength in others to help fix the situation. If I'm getting these words right, I apologize. I'm not the best at this. I get a bit rambly, but I'm just going to go ahead and move on before I say something I shouldn't again. And I think that's the best way to summarize my feelings on Hopkins' work overall, though. They're tough reads, and while I personally found Identical a far more uncomfortable read than Crank, it gets way more explicit in the adult scenes, and the adult scenes involve minors. They're still both reads I would recommend doing once, if you think you're ready for such a subject, that is. But with that being said, just remember, with each book comes an adventure. And every adventure's worth having, especially the banned ones. I'll see you later, everyone.